Hello everybody, welcome to Chess Meal. Today I'm going to talk about the Lucena position. Here we have king, rook, pawn versus king and rook. And in this case, the side with the pawn, the stronger side, can actually win this. In one of our previous videos, we talked about a very similar position called the Philidor position. That's a draw. So if you want to check that out, that would be sweet because they're very related and there's just some nuances for when this is a draw and when this is a win. This is a win when the stronger side has their king directly in front of their pawn. See, if we swap the kings around so that the white king is here and the black king is here, then that would reach Philidor position because the king's in front of the pawn. And that brings us to our first rule. Number one rule of Lucena position is we need our king directly in front of our own pawn, and we need the pawn on the 7th rank and the king on the 8th rank. It is white to move here. If we follow this rule, that gives us a very simple pawn f7. We have followed the first rule of Lucena's position. Now, what is the second rule? Well, let's suppose black waits around. How do you make progress? The best way to make progress is, so notice that there's one file between the opposing kings. We want two files in between the opposing kings. Not one, but two. How do we do this? Rook d1 check. We have followed the second rule already because after king c7, there are two files between the opposing kings. By the way, what if black tries king e6 here? Well, the problem with king e6 is that king e8 wins very easily because now there's no way at all to stop the promotion. There are no stalemate tricks. And if we try something like rook a2, threatening looks like checkmate, well, it's not because we can promote and we can block. So white is easily winning this position. That's why not king e6, but instead king c7. The final rule to making progress in this position is to build a bridge. What does this mean? So ideally, we have to move this king out of the way so that the pawn can promote. But the problem is, if we try to move him out of the way, black has an unlimited number of checks he can deliver. See, after the king goes to f5, black can deliver check, and white cannot bring his king closer because the pawn is hanging, and this would be a draw. So the king must stay close to his pawn, but black can just deliver unlimited checks. If you go here or something like that, then just rook f2 staying on the pawn, white has to go back. Same with if you go on the other way, yeah, white must go back. So you cannot bring your king out right away because that makes no progress. So what does white do? White must build a bridge. Rook d4. This is building the bridge. Why do we call it that? I'm not sure. But the point is we bring the rook behind our own pawn and in such a way that these unlimited checks will eventually run out because the king will be able to block the checks with his own rook. Let's see what I mean. So rook g3. Now we can do king e7 and rook e3, king f6. If rook f3, first we can go king to e6. And if black delivers another check, now we have this, we achieve this key bridge position after rook f3, well, king f5, rook f3, and now rook f4, blocking the check. By bringing the rook to the 4th rank, that gives white just enough resources to keep this pawn under control so that white can stop all the checks with his own rook. This position is completely winning for white. There's no way to stop this pawn. If you take, well, this pawn's promoting. That's why it's important, by the way, to create two opposing files between the kings, because if we keep only one file away, then black king will be able to catch up to the pawn on time. So if we don't deliver the preliminary check and go rook e4, well, the problem is, okay, well, first of all, white is kind of stuck here. He's going to have to make room for his king. But even if he's not, let's say rook h2, well, after king g7, rook g2, if we try the same idea of building a bridge, right? Well, the problem is that first, black can take, and after capture, black catches up with the pawn, and this is a draw. That's why you need to create two files, and that's why the second rule of creating two files is very important. So, step 1, king and pawn, king 8th rank, pawn 7th rank, king directly in front of the pawn. Step 2, create two files. Step 3, so king c7. Step 3 is build a bridge, rook d4. Let's look at some other tries black has. So after rook d4, if we wait again with rook g3, king e7, one idea black can try is to keep his rook on the f file. The idea of keeping the rook on the f file is, so there's no way that you can push the pawn yet. It has to be prepared. You cannot block this way, and if you retreat, then black delivers check. So how do you make progress? The key move is to play rook d5. The idea is to bring the rook to f5, blocking again and creating what I call a short bridge because, well, I don't know what a bridge is supposed to, why it's called that, but I just envision that there's a shorter crossing distance between the king and the rook. So that is pattern number 1. But what if earlier black goes to c6? The idea is to, after this rook d4, is to stop a rook d5 because the king's on it. How does it stop? Well, let's see. So king e7, check, check. Okay, and oops, not rook f1, rook f3. So if rook, oops, sorry, let me go back. I forgot to play rook d4. That's very important, otherwise black can just deliver checks on and on and on. And you don't want that, you want rook d4 first. Well, so if black waits, and we try the same idea, or stay on the f file, sorry. So the problem is rook d5 is not working because of rook takes f7. And so this is a draw because after rook d6, you can just go king c7 and the king stays on the rook, like this one. There's no way to win this as white. I mean, if rook a6 threatening rook a7 and also to take, well, first of all, you have king b7. Secondly, you could probably survive with rook f8. This is absolutely drawish. So you cannot play this rook d5 idea, but what you can do is try to play rook g4 with the idea of rook g5 and rook f5. Let's turn on the computer, verify that this is a win. Yes, it's an absolute win, of course. Well, that's because you can repeat and move to original positions. But let's just say something like Rook f3. Well, now you can play rook g5, and if we stay on the file, then rook f5. If we go check, then we can play king e6 or also rook e5. Both of these should work. I mean, after this check, well, you can already promote, so black must deliver check if he wants to stop the pawn, but rook f5 seals the game. So that's pattern number 2. Let's look at the final pattern. So after this king c6 idea and rook d4, well, rook g1, instead of rook g1, there could also be king c5, kicking the rook away from both of these squares. And now we don't get our usual bridge position. In this circumstance, you could try rook d7. The point of rook d7 is you're going to move your king. If the rook delivers check, you just block, and now you're going to promote. So for example, king c6, well, you can play king e8. If rook check, then block, and there's no way for black to hold. So, because you're going to promote, of course. That is the easiest way to deal with king going to c6 and then c5. That sums up everything you should know about Lucena position with a C, D, E, or F pawn. With knight pawns and rook pawns, they're a little bit different, but we'll be sure to cover those soon in future videos. So let's summarize. Step 1, create a position where the king's on the 8th rank and the 7th rank is a pawn directly behind it. Second, you want to create 2 files. And then finally, you want to build a bridge so that you can shelter your king away from checks and keep the pawn under control and promote it. And on the side, there are a couple patterns you should be aware of for when black plays against these rules, because those rules will not be universal. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.